This conference will now be recorded.
On Derek's
If
recording it.
you, okay, yep, somebody started the recording. All right. So that's kind of the broad takeaway from September 2019. We saw mostly non-detects, which indicated there would be, some very low levels, but below what the laboratory could detect. For our data that we collected in July, and that we put together this summary for this meeting, we're still reviewing the data. I would not consider it at this point 100% quality control, quality assurance reviewed. We're still looking into a few things, and that's kind of what we're summarizing here. One distinct difference that we see from September of last year to the July testing this year is that we reported detectable levels of ethylene oxide in every sample that we collected. So that's one distinct difference between the two efforts. We saw again that those detections were generally within the range that we're seeing at these other studies. So again, levels that are consistent with background concentrations of ethylene oxide, an average throughout the test group of about 1 part per billion. But we did see, and the reason I've got the asterisk on here, for the first time, and this is really for the first time in any of the studies that we've done, the laboratory indicated that some of the measurements had an interference with isobutane. That's one of the things that we're still digging into and looking into, as to what extent isobutane can influence those results. So we have, flagged some of those results as known interference with isobutane before we can, report what that level of ethylene oxide may be. We do have, again, a number of samples that, we do have some confident detections with, but again, those were generally within the range that we measured at those other studies. So a quick comment about isobutane. What is it? Isobutane is going to be, if you've ever been camping and you've used the little camp stove fuel, it's a common component of natural gas, and it's isolated for use in camping fuel and many other applications. It's used as an accelerant in some like aerosol cans that you might use. So it's a very sort of common chemical. Again, that is tentatively what has been identified as being an interferent in some of our samples, but not all. Obviously, one of the purposes of the study is to look and see if there's any apparent pattern around the Sterigenics facility itself to indicate that there are elevated levels of ethylene oxide specifically attributable to the Sterigenics facility, and we did not find that in this 9-day period of sampling. So that was, an important conclusion, I think, for the really particular aspect of this study. And, just as I've summarized here, we've now completed that 14-day sampling period with those remaining 9 days that we just completed in July. Again, just to kind of wrap up the broader conclusions, the continued efforts that we have with the laboratory now to improve that quantification, it's going to be difficult in cases where isobutane has interfered with that measurement, to identify how much of that each of those samples was ethylene oxide versus how much might have been the interferent. But we're going to continue to work with the laboratory to identify what we can do about that to get a more confident result for the ethylene oxide level in those locations. So really it was one primary location that showed those elevated levels, again, attributable to isobutane interference, and that was at the Whittier Mills Park, which is to the southwest, the Sterigenics facility, and really at the furthest southwest point on our sampling grid. So with that, I have the data table that I was just going to sort of, again, walk you through. This is very similar to what we did in our presentation last September. So this data table includes all of the results from last September, as well as the results that we have for the July effort. So you can see the September results and the July results for each of these locations. So Smyrna 1 is our general label that we have for that location. That was taken at Nickajack Park. In some instances, we did these duplicate samples, just to kind of keep an eye on the quantification and ensure that we're getting a good repeatable result. And so that's why you might see 2 samples for certain locations for the same day. But as you can see, just taking this one location, we did see some levels around the 0.7, 0.12 that were detectable back in September, but by and large, we had a number of non-detects. These little carets here, the less thans, indicate that these samples were non-detect for ethylene oxide back in September. That means that they were lower than the laboratory detection limit. And again, that was true for about 80% of our samples in September of last year. And you can see for the July samples, we had detects for each of our sampling locations. We didn't have any non-detects. Again, that's something that we look at, and we can theorize a few different things. If it was traffic related, if it was meteorological, those are all things that we're looking into. That being said, you can see the range for most of these samples is within the range of those detections that we see back in September. That range, anything up to about 1 part per billion, we would consider, very consistent with background levels that we would find in any of these other studies that have been conducted, the studies we've done, the studies EPA has done, other state agencies. 1 part per billion is not particularly unusual. When we do see levels that are above 1 part per billion, maybe again, this is one that went up to about 3.4 parts per billion on July 15 and 16. One of the things that we'll do is start, again, I'm getting a little feedback on the audio. I'm not sure who that's coming
Trying
from.
to figure out which line that is. If you're not speaking, can I remind you to please mute your line?
Looks like
Please
it might
mute
be
your
coming
line
from
if
the
you're not
caller
speaking.
that
This one?
just dialed in, caller 7.
Should be.
I have the
Just a second. We're going to go ahead and mute everybody. I think that's his, isn't it? I think that's him, isn't it? Yeah. If you hold over there, you can mute it. All right, I think we've got it now. No, we just muted his. That's what I thought.
All right, you should be able to hear me now.
There we go.
All right. Got a little bit of feedback still from caller 2, but
Where's caller
I
2?
can.
Just a moment, and I'll try to identify where that
No
caller
worries.
is and mute.
Okay, it looks like it's, nope, still a little feedback. Caller 2.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I think we're good. I think you might be caller 2.
All right. You should be able to hear me now. Huh, interesting. Okay, well, it sounds good here now. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. All right. So yeah, as I was saying, again, when we see this 3.4, one of the things that we do is we look back at the meteorology and we see if there's anything in particular, that would be an identifiable source, or any other particular cause. A 3.4 part per billion, we still have seen in background locations in some of our other studies. I'd say it's not as common, but we've seen it in areas, up to close to 10 parts per billion in areas associated with high vehicle traffic. And so there's, other potential causes for those background levels. And again, another thing that we're going to now continue to look into is if that particular sample was potentially influenced by isobutane. as we scroll down for these other samples, again, those are sort of the thresholds that we look at as triggering some additional investigation. You can see these here in the 0.47. Those, again, very typical of what we've seen in background locations. And one of the other things that we're doing is looking at, are we seeing a particular pattern or trend at a particular location? In other words, where we're seeing an anomalous reading like this, 6 parts per billion, there may be, again, some other cause, but again, not unusual from the standpoint of what we've seen in other studies. It is, again, looking at this as at fire station number 3, back in September, primarily non-detect at that location. And for this range of sampling for July of this year, again, mostly in the low to single digit to less than 1 part per billion range. We see one day that's slightly elevated. Again, we're not seeing a pattern that it's an elevated reading on an everyday basis. And so, again, that may be caused by, some other source, and or, vehicle traffic, things of that nature. That's where we've seen some of those higher levels in other studies. At the City Hall back in September, all non-detects. July detects, but at those below 1 ppb or in the 1 part per billion range. We did not do any indoor sampling at the City Hall this July. And fire station number 4, again, very similar story. 1 small detect back in September, and during this July period, right around a 1 part per billion average. Same basic story for our other locations. Smyrna School 1. You can see those ranges are in the less than or right up to 1 ppb, with one result that's slightly higher on July 11-12. And similar conclusions for Cobb 1 location, the RL Sutton property. We had some low-level detects last September, similar but a little higher, and all detected in the July study. We do see, that it's potentially in some other studies we've also seen where it may be, some seasonal effects. But again, that's something that just is still being investigated. For the location near the RL Sutton plant on the east, similar results, less than 1 ppb, with a couple right at 1 ppb and one a little higher at 3.1 parts per billion, again within the range of what we've seen in other studies. On the Plant Atkinson Road right-of-way at Cobb 3, very similar. Recall in September of last year at the Argos plant, which is directly to the south of the Sterigenics facility, we did see one result at 4.4 ppb. That was the highest that we saw for any of our studies last time. This, again, though, within range of what we had seen in some other Atlanta studies in the area. So single-digit part per billion, not unusual for one particular sample. And again, similar results in the order of 1 ppb, with a few that are slightly elevated. And again, one of the things that we look at here, with this being one of the closer sampling sites to the Sterigenics facility, is evaluating the wind in each of these samples to see if it's upwind or downwind. And again, we didn't see any real pattern of wind blowing towards this particular location as being evident of Sterigenics contributing materially to those concentrations. And then the one location that we, again, identified and know that isobutane was a particular interferent was at this location. We call Atlanta 1 at Whittier Mills Park. And so we've notated each of these results, and you can see some of these are quite a bit higher. The laboratory, is real clear that those samples had been interfered with. So we've put the numbers here, but again, recognize that a large proportion of that sample is going to be as a result of isobutane. That is some of the efforts that we're still going through with the laboratory to identify how much might have been ethylene oxide versus isobutane. That may prove difficult to do, but that is something that we're going to continue to look at. That really was the primary location where we saw that interference. And then again, we're looking into the other locations just to ensure that we didn't have that same situation. For Atlanta 2 at Spink Collins Park, we had the following results. One small detect last September, detects higher for this sampling period, but again, single digit part per billion, around 1 part per billion, very consistent with what we've seen in our other studies. For Atlanta 3, one small detect last September, and very similar conclusions for this sampling period in July. One reading at 3.2, no real obvious reason for that. Again, not different from what we've seen in our other studies. For the Margaret Mitchell School, Atlanta 4, all non-detect last September. We did see all detects this sampling period, but again, in that same kind of range, right around 1 ppb for the July effort. For Atlanta 5 at Sutton Middle School, all non-detects in September, all detects for the July study, and in the same range. So I know I'm sounding a little bit like a broken record, but just wanted to give you the chance to look at all of the data in total. We do expect, at some point to have all of this go final when we're done with our quality assurance and quality control, and have dug a little deeper into the isobutane. So just wanted to make sure to give you a good preview of what the results were showing. Boyd Elementary, all non-detect in September, all detect, and all right around 1 part per billion, one slight exception above for the July study. At the A.D. Williams Park, same basic story, a small detect in September, and with one exception, primarily around 1 ppb or a little less, and again, no particular reason that we've identified for that one higher result. So the takeaway, again, is data that are very consistent, data that are detects for this go round as opposed to the September study where we had a lot of non-detects. And again, those data are consistent with what we see at background levels in other studies, and no real pattern around the Sterigenics facility itself. Ben, I might, since I'm starting to sound like a broken record, I might turn to you and see if you think I've missed anything or anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think you covered it well. Just a couple things to add. So we sampled at 20 different locations here in July. One thing to note is we did not do sampling in the indoor locations like we did in September, and that was just mainly because of just access issues with COVID-19 and some of these places being closed for access. So I know when you look at this table, you may realize some of the indoor samples from September. I wanted to point out that that was the reason why those were not included. The other thing to add is that Atlanta 1 location is about 2 miles south of the Sterigenics facility. So just to give a bit of context of where that location is in relation to Sterigenics facility.
Right.
Other than that, Darren, nothing else to add. I think you covered it well.
Okay, well, with that, I'll go back to the slideshow. Basically, those are our broad conclusions at this stage, and certainly, we're going to continue that effort in looking into the isobutane interference issue. And again, it's the first time that we've run into that. It is a common component of natural gas, so we know there are some potential sources in the area. Very common chemical. It's just a standard. If you're familiar with natural gas that we use in our homes to burn our for water heaters, for stoves, things of that nature, it is a component of that. Just a real basic fuel, very low toxicity, so not something to be concerned about. Certainly at these levels, the part per billion range for isobutane would not be particularly uncommon. It's just something that we've seen in this study that we're still again trying to look into and figure out what proportion of those samples was isobutane versus ethylene oxide. But we of course know we're going to get some questions about that, and we're trying to dig down and drill down into that issue as best we can.
Thank you for your,
that is the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to open it up for questions from the Oversight Committee. One question I had, Sterigenics during this time of your data collection was fully operational, correct?
That's our understanding, yes.
Okay, important to know. I'd like to open it up now. If you've joined us virtually on the Oversight Committee, or if you're here, any questions of Dyron or Benjamin?
Dyron, thanks so much for your work. Greatly appreciated. To give a frame of reference for our numbers, could you share how the testing data we received and results compared to your testing data in Illinois, in Willowbrook?
Sure, yeah. Willowbrook, we saw for the most part samples in the same concentration range. We did see some readings at that study as high as we saw one that was above 300 parts per billion. So that was one of the ones that certainly, was a cause for concern in that study. So we didn't see anything close to that, but by and large, we do see that approximately 1 part per billion as background in a lot of the other studies, Willowbrook included, with the exception of a few, much higher readings.
Okay,
thank you.
Ross?
And you mentioned, I think at one point, 10 parts per billion is still considered background. When does it become a concerning number?
Yeah, really at 10, I wouldn't consider 10 to be normal. We've not seen in all of our studies 10 other than in Willowbrook. And so that to us, is really a threshold where we really need to drill down. One caution I would give, and I know we covered this, I think last time, just in regards to the thresholds that are important, is it's important to remember that those thresholds are important over a long period of time. So when we see one day at an elevated level, it's not something that is a cause for concern for that single day. But if we see that pattern persisting over days and days or months, that's really the toxicity of ethylene oxide. Really is the concern over a long-term exposure, not a short-term. So we're using these shorter-term studies to try to identify those patterns if they exist. That's one thing we did start to see in Willowbrook, because we saw higher readings cropping up more frequently, and that's the sort of thing we're looking for. But at 10, certainly that's when we are going to start looking to see if there's a pattern above that level.
What I have a question. What standard is used to determine, based on your estimation, when you talk about 10 parts per billion or 5 or 3 or 20, what standard is it that you're using to decide what of those levels makes it dangerous for the public, or what do you use to base that on?
That's a good question. So there really is no enforceable standard at this point. What we are looking at from a guidance standpoint is of course, the EPA's threshold that they've set is at far lower than even we can detect with our sampling. The TCEQ has done a deep review. That's the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They've done a deep review of the same toxicity data that the EPA based their number on. And so we're using their numbers as guidance. Their numbers are for the 1 in 10,000 excess cancer risk over a lifetime exposure. Again, long-term exposure, keeping that in mind, is around 1 part per billion. So we look at that as kind of being, a metric that we can compare these against. The American Chemistry Council, which is the industry association, actually has a level that's slightly lower at 0.25 parts per billion. So that's one that we're, also mindful of. But again, none of these are enforceable at this point. The best I could say is that there's still a lot of toxicology review about ethylene oxide that's taking place. So I'm not sure that there's any agency or even the industry association's got a real firm, data point that we could compare against. But on these single day samples, again, at this point, our goal is looking for patterns. It's looking for, if we see those elevated levels on a frequent basis, because we really recognize any of those standards are relevant only to a lifetime exposure. So we're looking for, if there's any glaring or obvious issues, if that makes sense. Those are the levels that we're comparing against. And again, not enforceable, but those are the guidelines that are being put out.
Thank you. Other questions from the committee? Commissioner Cupid. Can you hear her?
Not very well.
Okay.
Can we go back to the table where we saw the Argus plant and Plant Atkinson?
Go back to the table where you see the Argus and Plant Atkinson plants.
Sure.
Pull that back up for us, please.
Sure, let me just get there. I think that might be down. Okay.
You can
This
scroll.
will be our COB 3.
Maybe scroll up just a little bit more for us.
We can continue scrolling.
There we go.
Is Plant Atkinson on the next page? Well,
Okay.
Let me see if I can. She's wanting to know if the Plant Atkinson is on the next page as well. It's just the
Okay,
other.
and it's just
Okay.
these. Yeah, just
Okay.
these for Plant Atkinson.
more so for the Argus plant, there are multiple samples that are higher than one. I know that Ross asked a question about whether or not there was concern about elevated levels beyond background levels with 10 or higher. But I kept hearing 1 part per billion as being the base level that you're trying not to exceed. And I saw multiple samples over 1 part per billion. I don't know if there was any thought given to the multiple samples that came over 1 part per billion. And if there was or was not, why not or why?
I heard most of that. I didn't catch if there was something associated with the 1 part per billion.
She's asking if she's heard that the 1 part per billion is kind of a measuring point there. What consideration or what was there extra discussion or consideration for those levels that were above 1 part per billion? And if so, why? If not, why?
Right. No, yeah, we're definitely constantly looking at, anything that's over 1 part per billion. And one of the first things that we'll do is we'll look at the meteorology. So was the wind blowing towards or from? And that's not, one that we could really see a pattern for that. Again, that's another set of samples that we're looking at to ensure, whether we did or did not see any isobutane interference. So that's another one that we're drilling down on. From the weather, so we do the kind of two-phase. So we're looking at the laboratory side. We're also going to look at the meteorology side.
Thank you. And if you can help clarify again what the actionable levels are again, and speaking with representation from the EPA prior to this group coming together, I just remember them emphasizing that threshold of 1 part per billion. But I've heard you share during this presentation that the sample sizes were not actionable. And we do see some points where we do see sample sizes over 1 part per billion. Do you take those sample sizes and do you average them out over that period of time? How do you take this data and then project that it's not at an actionable level?
Yeah, so a couple of challenges I think that we still have there. One is there really at this point is not an agreed upon actionable level. So even at the lifetime exposure, there's still quite a bit of debate within the toxicology community over what the meaning of the data are. So all of the studies that have taken place thus far have been based upon a pretty limited data set. So the toxicologists that have done the evaluations that have set these various levels are all basing their analysis on the same toxicology data set from some NIOSH studies from 20, 30 years ago. Those data sets and how they're interpreted is what's leading to these, different levels that may or may not at some point become actionable, but that's still all quite a bit in debate. And then in regards to the sample size, one of the reasons that we have done 14-day studies, and in this case, we've actually had the added benefit of being able to spread that out over a couple of years, or 2 different years basically, and 2 different seasonal situations. I do think we maybe are seeing some patterns that are seasonal, but again, that's something I think that still is going to require some more study. The EPA is continuing to do some broad sampling. Other groups are, doing sampling, the American Chemistry Council, other industry groups. And so I think, that the sample data set is not one that can grow at a local level. It's really got to be, at a national level effort. And it's happening sort of organically right now. There's really, aside from the EPA's efforts, which have taken place over a broad geography and a longer period of time, there's really no other, coordinated national efforts to get that, let's just say, years worth of data that can, start to be compared directly against the toxicology studies, if that makes sense. So our 14 days, what we're, trying to do is at least location by location for that season, for that particular situation, is look for, glaring patterns of higher levels, or lower levels, whatever it is that we find, for that comparison. But, the broader studies are going to have to kind of come in over time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions from the committee?
I have a question.
Okay, George, you have to speak up so he can hear you. You might want to either remove your mouse, just speak loudly so he can hear you.
Overall, what would you say to the people living in this region? Are we going to observe a continuous monitor by the EPA, or what's the forecast as we move forward?
Yeah, I'm personally not aware of any efforts that are planned for your particular region. I know for our effort and what we've been asked to do, this completed our 14-day period. We have had some discussions with EPA, and I know that there is some future sampling planned, but I'm not sure the locations that they're keying in for that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions from the committee? Any other discussion? Anybody virtually on the committee making comment or no? Chief, anything else that we need to do?
I think at this point, we obviously more complete data than we had. Again, the idea was to, as Byron has stated, to kind of give us a snapshot as to what's going on within our community. As he stated, there's still a tremendous amount of answers that need to be had, a lot of debate internally with what the data means. But my takeaway is that, especially when you have the perspective of what they found up at Willowbrook, and thank you, Tim, for asking that. To me, it's a different story. I think that what we're seeing, I believe in what GHD is telling us, that they've got data from all across the country, and what they're seeing here is similar to what they've seen, and that's why he references as background level. What's also interesting is information that we've heard in the past for all the different public meetings when we hear from the State Department of Public Health, and we talk about cancer rates across the state, specifically in this region. So to me, a lay perspective obviously is what's dangerous and what's not. If we had dangerous levels, then we ought to see, some discernible spike in an area with regard to cancer rates and things like that. And obviously, I don't work for the State Department of Public Health, but my memory is that they didn't see that spike. And somebody correct me if they heard it differently. But so not only what do we see with regard to this study, what has happened, what has been the net effect over time in the past, if that makes sense comparing those two. So I just appreciate the work that they had done. I just wanted to point out, like the mayor has, we reached out to this specific group of individuals because this was the exact team that was tasked with ambient air sampling up in Willowbrook, Illinois. And we all know what happened there, where they did find those few samples that's, in the several hundred parts per billion. And the governor of Illinois was eventually able to take some action because of that. So we wanted to use that same thing.
Thank you, Chief. The whole reason for doing all this is to make sure that all of our citizens are safe and the air that we're breathing is safe. And so I really appreciate the data that y'all have been able to provide us, and we'll look forward to working with y'all in the future. Continue this partnership. Thank you so much for what you've done. Any other comments before we adjourn? All right, we're adjourned. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yes, sir. Thank you.